There are moments in life when silence feels heavier than noise, when the world keeps moving, but something inside you stops. Moments when words fail, and all that remains is a song you barely have the strength to sing. Across the world, in hospital rooms and kitchen tables, in crowded churches and lonely nights, the same words rise again and again. Blessed assurance. People sing it when they are certain, and people sing it when they are not. They sing it when life is steady, and they sing it when everything has fallen apart. Because assurance is not something we reach for when we are strong. It is something we cling to when we are not. And yet, most who sing these words have never stopped to ask where they came from, who shaped them, or what kind of soul could write such calm confidence in a world that offers so little of it. This story begins not with music, but with darkness. Not metaphorical darkness, but the kind that arrives without warning and never leaves. Fanny Crosby lost her sight before she learned to speak in full sentences, before memory had a shape, before the world could be missed. She never knew color, never knew faces, never knew the simple privilege of seeing where she was going. And yet, she would spend her life guiding millions toward peace. That alone should make us pause, because we live in an age that measures vision by what can be seen, success by what can be displayed, and worth by what can be proven. Fanny Crosby had none of those things. She had no platform, no physical independence, no public power. What she had was something far more fragile and far more dangerous. She had trust. Not the loud, triumphant kind, but the quiet, practiced trust that forms when disappointment is not a season, but a lifetime. Many people speak of faith when life is kind. Few do when faith becomes the only thing left to hold. Fanny did not wake up one morning and decide to be inspirational. She did not turn suffering into a brand. She did not pretend loss was painless. She simply learned how to live without bitterness, and that may be the most radical act of all. She learned to listen to people, to scripture, to sorrow, to hope. She learned to sit with pain without demanding an explanation, and somewhere in that listening, songs began to form. Not songs of escape, not songs of denial, but songs that told the truth, that life can wound deeply and still be held by God. Her hymns do not shout victory, they whisper rest. They do not promise ease, they promise presence. They do not say, everything will be fine. They say, you are not alone. And perhaps that is why they endure. Because every generation discovers, sooner or later, that certainty is fragile, that strength fades, that control is an illusion. And when it does, we reach not for arguments, but for assurance. Fanny Crosby lived through a nation tearing itself apart, through war, industrial chaos, poverty, and spiritual hunger. She walked city streets filled with suffering she could not see, yet somehow understood more clearly than most. She sat with the poor, prayed with the broken, gave away what little she had. And then she went home and gave the world songs. Songs that crossed denominations, races, borders, and centuries. Songs that found their way into revival tents and prison cells, into hospital corridors and funeral processions. Songs that asked one quiet question again and again. What if peace is not the absence of pain, but the presence of trust? Fanny Crosby's life confronts us with an uncomfortable truth, that seeing is not the same as understanding, that loss does not disqualify us from purpose, and that assurance, real assurance, is not built on circumstance, but on surrender. She never saw the world, but she saw people. She never read her own words, but she wrote them with unflinching honesty. She never watched her legacy grow, but she planted it anyway, one hymn at a time. This is not the story of a blind woman who overcame adversity. It is the story of a woman who refused to let adversity define the size of her soul. It is the story of how faith can remain gentle in a violent world, how hope can stay tender without becoming naive, and how one quiet life lived faithfully can teach millions how to rest. Long after the voice that wrote the song has fallen silent, the song continues, still sung, still needed, still offering assurance to those who cannot see the way forward, but choose to trust it exists. This is the life and the legacy of Fanny Crosby. Before Fanny Crosby learned the shape of the world slipped out of sight. There was no moment of realization, no before and after she could remember. Only a story told later by those who loved her enough to carry the memory for her. She was still an infant when a local doctor applied a treatment meant to help, a simple poultice for an eye infection. It was a common remedy, well-intentioned, and disastrously wrong. By the time the mistake was understood, the damage was done. Fanny Crosby would never see. It is tempting from a distance to turn this moment into tragedy, to let it define everything that followed. But her life resists such simplicity, because what shaped her most was not the loss itself, but what met her in its wake. She grew up in a small New York village, in a household where silence was never allowed to become emptiness. Her grandmother spoke scripture into the dark, not as doctrine, but as story. She described mountains Fanny could not see, fields she could not walk alone, skies she would never look up to admire. Words became windows, language became landscape. And slowly, something remarkable happened. While other children learned to name what they saw, Fanny learned to name what she felt. The sound of a rocking chair became comfort. The smell of grass meant freedom. The cadence of a familiar voice meant safety. Her world was not smaller, it was different. And difference, when nurtured with love, can become strength. In the 19th century, blindness was often treated as a sentence to dependency, to obscurity, to quiet removal from public life. Blind children were not expected to learn deeply, to lead, or to contribute. But Fanny's family refused that story. They did not tell her what she lacked, they told her who she was becoming. They did not lower expectations, they raised attention. They taught her to memorize, not out of necessity, but as a form of delight. Poetry, scripture, and song were not assignments, they were companions. And memory, carefully trained, became her way of seeing. Years later, Fanny would say something that unsettles modern ears. She would say she was grateful for her blindness, not because pain is pleasant, not because loss is virtuous, but because she believed, with a conviction born of long practice, that God had not abandoned her in the dark. That belief did not come cheaply. It was forged in small moments, in scraped knees she could not see coming, in doors she misjudged, in laughter she could not locate. Moments when frustration whispered that the world was not made for her. And yet, she learned to stay, to listen longer, to trust deeper, to believe that a life need not be easy to be good. This early world of sound and memory taught her something she would never unlearn, that faith is not about clarity, it is about orientation, not seeing the path, but choosing whom to follow. Fanny did not grow up imagining herself exceptional. She did not know she would write thousands of hymns. She did not know her words would outlive her. All she knew was that she was loved. And that love, faithfully repeated, can anchor a soul more securely than sight ever could. Before there were songs, there was listening. Before there was assurance, there was trust. And before the world learned her name, a blind child learned something far more enduring, that darkness does not have the final word if the heart remains open to light. When Fanny Crosby left home for the first time, she did not carry luggage filled with certainty. She carried something far heavier: expectation. At 15 years old, she entered the New York Institution for the Blind. For many, such institutions were places of containment, designed to shelter, not to unleash potential. But for Fanny, it became something else entirely. It became a proving ground. The building itself was unfamiliar. Echoing halls, measured footsteps, voices she had not yet learned to place. She could not read faces. She could not navigate without care. But she could listen, and she listened relentlessly. She learned languages by sound and rhythm, history by cadence and repetition, music not as ornament, but as structure. Her memory, already disciplined by years of quiet training, expanded until it astonished even her teachers. She could hold entire poems in her mind, not as fragments, but as living, breathing wholes. In a world that measured intelligence by written proof, Fanny carried knowledge internally, unseen, unrecorded, but no less real, and in time, impossible to ignore. She could not merely learn, she performed. She stood before audiences and recited verse with confidence that unsettled expectations. Her blindness, which society assumed would diminish her presence, somehow sharpened it. People came to hear her. Then they came to remember her. Presidents listened. Crowds gathered. A blind teenage girl became improbably a public voice. But public recognition carries its own temptations. Praise can quietly replace purpose. Applause can begin to define worth. Fanny felt this tension early. She was admired, yet still dependent. Celebrated, yet still constrained. She lived within the walls of the institution, first as a student, then as a teacher. It was a respectable life, a safe life, but safety is not the same as calling. One moment in particular reveals the steel beneath her gentleness. Standing before the United States Senate, Fanny Crosby addressed men who held power she would never possess. She did not ask for sympathy. She asked for opportunity. She spoke for blind children whose futures were being quietly decided without them. Her words were clear, measured, unapologetic. And in that room, something shifted. Because faith, when paired with courage, can step into spaces not designed to welcome it. Yet, even as her reputation grew, Fanny remained inwardly restless. She was accomplished, but not yet aligned. Educated, but not yet fulfilled. There is a peculiar loneliness that comes when your gifts are visible, but your purpose is still hidden. Many people know this feeling, the sense that you are doing well, and yet something essential remains untouched. Fanny sensed it too. Her poems impressed, her performances dazzled, but her soul was still listening for a deeper note. Years later, she would leave the institution and step into the wider world as a professional writer. But the scholar was already formed, not merely a student of books, but a student of restraint, discipline, and attention. She learned that brilliance does not require spectacle, that intellect does not need sight, and that knowledge, unanchored to service, eventually grows hollow. This season taught her a lesson she would carry forward, that gifts are not given for display, they are entrusted for use, and that learning, when held humbly, becomes preparation for something greater than recognition. She did not yet know what shape that calling would take, but she was being readied. Quietly, faithfully, one word at a time. By the time Fanny Crosby reached adulthood, she had already learned how to survive. She had learned how to adapt, how to excel, how to become impressive in rooms that were not built with her in mind. What she had not yet learned was how to rest. The world she entered as a professional writer was one that rewarded productivity more than purpose. It asked not who you were becoming, but how much you could produce. and Fanny could produce. She wrote lyrics that fit neatly into popular melodies, songs meant for parlors and performance halls, songs that pleased audiences and publishers alike. They were successful. They were admired. They were profitable. For a woman in the 19th century, blind, unmarried, and financially independent, this was no small thing. She had done what many women are taught to do: make herself useful, make herself reliable, make herself excellent. And yet, usefulness can quietly become a cage when it replaces calling. Fanny was praised for what she could do, but rarely asked who she was. She was busy and inwardly unfulfilled. This tension is familiar to many women, the feeling of doing everything right, working hard, being capable, being dependable, and still sensing that something essential is being postponed. Not denied, just delayed. Fanny's work filled rooms, but it did not yet fill her. At the same time, her personal life unfolded, not with drama, but with gentleness. She married Alexander Van Alstyne, a fellow musician, who did not seek to manage her gifts, only to honor them. Their marriage was quiet, unremarkable by public standards, and that too is instructive. In an era, and even today, where women are often told to choose between love and purpose, Fanny chose partnership. She did not disappear into marriage. She did not shrink. She continued to write, continued to work, continued to think. She kept her name, not as rebellion, but as identity. She understood something many women learn slowly, that commitment does not require erasure. Together, they knew loss. They knew the ache of unanswered prayers. They knew financial uncertainty. And through it all, Fanny kept writing. But a subtle dissatisfaction followed her, not because she lacked success, but because success had not yet met surrender. She was skilled, but she was still holding something back. Sometimes we confuse momentum with direction. We keep moving because stopping feels dangerous, but movement without meaning eventually exhausts the soul. Fanny was nearing midlife when she encountered a question that would change everything. Not a challenge, not a rebuke, an invitation. William Bradbury listened to her work and saw past its polish. He did not ask her to improve her craft. He asked her to trust her voice, to stop writing what sold and begin writing what she believed. It was a small moment, the kind we often underestimate, but women know these moments well. The moment someone finally names what you have been carrying silently. The moment when your life, as it currently stands, is gently called forward. By then, Fanny was no longer young. She was 44 years old, an age when society often assumes a woman's most important work is already behind her. But God does not measure seasons the way we do. Fanny's years of waiting had not been wasted. Her restraint had been preparation, her disappointments a refining fire. She had lived long enough to know that faith is not naive, that joy is not shallow, that assurance must be earned through trust. When she began to write hymns, she did not write from theory, she wrote from experience, from nights when hope had to be chosen, from mornings when courage arrived quietly, from a life that had learned to live fully without demanding explanation. The words came quickly, not because she rushed, but because she had been listening her whole life. This was not reinvention, it was alignment, the moment when a woman stops striving and starts offering. She was not late, though the world might have said so, though others her age were already being remembered for what they had once been. Fanny Crosby was not behind schedule, she was being prepared. By the time the invitation came to write not what was popular but what was true, she had lived enough life to know the difference. She had learned that faith, when rushed, becomes fragile, that joy, when forced, becomes shallow, and that assurance, if it is to mean anything at all, must be tested. Her years had not emptied her, they had filled her, quietly, carefully, with stories, with sorrow, with steadiness. So when the words finally came, they did not come from ambition, they came from rest, from a woman who no longer needed to prove that she was capable, or useful, or worthy. She simply offered what she had been given, and what she offered carried weight, because it had been lived. She had waited long enough to trust her own voice, long enough to believe that obedience matters more than timing, and faithfulness more than recognition. The world would soon hear her songs, but before they ever reached the crowds, they had already done their first work, quietly shaping the heart of the woman who wrote them. And in that stillness, a door opened, not to fame, not to applause, but to purpose. And once it opened, it would never close again. There are moments when everything you have lived suddenly makes sense, not because life becomes easier, but because it becomes aligned. For Fanny Crosby, that moment did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived quietly, almost gently. After decades of listening, learning, waiting, and enduring, the words she had been carrying began to rise. Not in fragments, not in uncertainty. They arrived whole, fully formed, certain, unapologetic. Fanny did not sit with pen and paper, crossing out lines and doubting herself. She did not revise endlessly or wait for confidence to appear. She trusted the work that had already been done inside her. This is an important truth, especially for women who have spent years preparing without permission. We often imagine creativity as a sudden gift, when in reality, it is the result of long, faithful accumulation, of prayers whispered without witnesses, of tears shed in private, of patience practiced when progress felt invisible. Fanny's hymns flowed because her life had already shaped them. She composed in her mind, fully, completely, before a single word was spoken aloud. And when she dictated, she did so with astonishing speed, not because she was hurried, but because she was ready. 6, sometimes 7 hymns in a single day, not out of pressure, not out of ambition, out of abundance. This was not burnout, it was release. The years she had spent learning restraint now made room for overflow. Her blindness, once assumed to be a limitation, became a discipline. Without visual distraction, she listened deeply to scripture, to melody, to the inner movement of thought in prayer. She did not write to impress theologians, she wrote to reach hearts. And that choice, intentional, instinctive, changed everything. Her language was simple, intimate, personal. She did not speak of God as distant, she spoke of him as near. This, too, is a lesson many women learn the hard way, that clarity is more powerful than complexity, that truth does not need ornament to endure. Fanny trusted the plainness of her faith. She trusted that sincerity, when offered without defense, would find its way. And it did. Her hymns did not remain on the page, they moved. They were sung by the weary, by the poor, by those who had no words of their own. They carried assurance, not as certainty of outcome, but as confidence in presence. And this matters, because women know what it means to carry responsibility quietly, to show up without applause, to believe without guarantees. Fanny's creative wellspring reminds us that productivity does not always look frantic, that calling does not arrive loudly, and that the most fruitful seasons of life often come after long periods of obscurity. She did not become prolific by striving harder. She became prolific by surrendering fully. There is freedom in that. Freedom from comparison, freedom from fear of starting late, freedom from the lie that your best work must happen when the world expects it. Fanny Crosby's hymns poured forth because she had finally given herself permission to trust the voice that had been forming within her for decades. Her life teaches us this, that your waiting is not wasted, that your quiet years are not empty, that your gifts mature in hidden places. And when the time comes, not when you force it, but when you are ready, what has been stored will flow, not as noise, but as nourishment, not as performance, but as offering. And once that wellspring is opened, it does not run dry. It simply continues, song after song, meeting the world's deepest needs with words born of faithfulness. No calling is carried alone. Even the most singular voices are shaped by those willing to listen. As Fanny Crosby's hands began to move beyond her own circle, they did not travel by accident. They traveled through relationship, through trust, through collaboration, through men who recognized a gift and chose not to control it. This matters because for many women, talent is not ignored, but managed, redirected, softened, contained. Fanny encountered something different. Composers like William Bradbury, William Doane, and Ira Sankey did not ask her to become someone else. They asked her to be more fully herself. They did not dilute her words. They carried them. Her lyrics found melodies that knew how to make space. Space for conviction without aggression, for tenderness without weakness, for faith without pretense. And together, they created something greater than any one of them could have produced alone. This is the quiet power of partnership, not competition, not hierarchy, but shared obedience. Her hymns reached revival halls not because they were strategic, but because they were needed. Post-war America was bruised, grieving, uncertain of its future. People were not looking for argument, they were looking for comfort. And comfort, when it is honest, requires vulnerability. Fanny gave voice to a kind of faith that did not demand resolution, only trust. Her words traveled with revivalists into crowded cities and forgotten neighborhoods, sung by voices she would never hear, felt by hearts she would never meet. And something remarkable happened. Her hymns became communal property. They were no longer hers alone. This, too, is a lesson many women learn slowly, that impact often requires release. To let your work leave you, to allow it to be shaped, shared, and sung in ways you cannot control. Fanny did this without fear. She understood that purpose is not possession. As her collaborations expanded, so did her reach, but not her ego. She remained grounded, uninterested in acclaim, focused on service. She did not measure success by visibility. She measured it by usefulness. In an era that often silenced women's voices, Fanny's voice moved freely, not because she demanded space, but because she had something essential to say. Her partnerships were not about elevation, they were about amplification. They remind us that when women are trusted, not just tolerated, not just featured, but genuinely partnered with, the culture shifts. Songs become movements, lyrics become lifelines. And through these relationships, Fanny's hymns did what sermons often could not. They crossed barriers. They stayed when the preacher left. They returned to people in the quiet moments when faith had to be lived, not discussed. These partnerships shaped an era because they were built on humility, because no one sought ownership of the message, only faithfulness to it. And in that shared faithfulness, a nation learned to sing what it had been struggling to believe. There is a kind of seeing that has nothing to do with the eyes. It is the kind that notices pain before it announces itself, the kind that recognizes need without requiring proof. Fanny Crosby had learned this way of seeing early, long before the world called it ministry. As her hymns traveled farther and farther, carrying hope into churches and revival halls, Fanny herself walked in the opposite direction, toward the margins, toward the places where songs were not sung for beauty, but for survival. The Bowery, Water Street, crowded tenements and mission halls thick with hunger, illness, and despair. These were not places one visited for inspiration. They were places that stripped illusion away. Fanny went anyway. Week after week, she entered rooms where poverty was not a concept, but a smell, where stories were not told politely, but spilled out in desperation. She sat beside women who had been abandoned, overworked, forgotten, or blamed for circumstances they did not choose. She listened. She prayed. She gave, often far more than was reasonable. This was not charity from a distance, it was presence. And presence, especially for women, is costly. Because we are often taught to give endlessly, to carry emotional weight without asking who will carry us. But Fanny's compassion was not rooted in self-erasure, it was rooted in conviction. She did not go to be needed, she went because she believed every soul mattered. She did not romanticize suffering, she met it, and what she encountered reshaped her songs. Hymns like Rescue the Perishing did not emerge from imagination, they emerged from faces, from hands that trembled as they reached for food, from voices that cracked as they confessed regret, fear, and hope all at once. Her lyrics gained urgency, not because she grew louder, but because she grew closer. This is an important distinction. Compassion does not require performance, it requires proximity. Fanny understood that the deepest ministry often happens away from platforms, in places where no one is keeping count. She did not separate faith from action. She did not believe worship ended with a song. She believed it continued in how one lives. Her earnings, substantial by the standards of her time, rarely stayed with her. She gave freely, quietly, often anonymously, not because she felt obligated, but because she felt responsible. This, too, is a lesson many women wrestle with, how to give without losing oneself. Fanny's life does not offer easy formulas. She gave sacrificially, and she paid for it. But she also lived with joy, because her generosity was not driven by guilt, it was driven by gratitude. She believed that what had been entrusted to her was never meant to stop with her. And yet, she did not confuse service with saviorhood. She pointed beyond herself, always. Her blindness in these spaces became strangely irrelevant. Those she served were not looking for someone who could see them, they were looking for someone who would stay. Fanny stayed, and in staying, she learned something profound. That assurance is not the absence of suffering, it is the courage to enter it without fear. Her missionary heart reminds us that the measure of a life is not how widely it is admired, but how deeply it is given. That purpose does not always elevate us. Sometimes it lowers us into the places where love is most needed. And that faith, when it is real, will always move us outward, toward others. Fanny Crosby did not just write hymns for the church, she lived them. In soup kitchens, in crowded rooms, in whispered prayers no one recorded. Her songs carried comfort because her life had learned to carry people, and through her quiet, faithful presence, the music gained flesh, hope found hands, and assurance became more than a word. It became a way of living. Fame has a way of changing people. It introduces noise where there was once quiet, expectation where there was once freedom, and for many, it slowly replaces purpose with performance. But Fanny Crosby grew older without growing hardened. As the years passed, her name became familiar, not just in churches, but in households across the nation. People spoke of her with affection. They called her Aunt Fanny, not because she cultivated warmth, but because she embodied it. She traveled often now, spoke frequently, appeared before crowds who already knew her words by heart. And yet, she remained remarkably unchanged. There is a particular grace in a woman who has nothing left to prove. Fanny had lived long enough to know that admiration fades, that applause moves on. So she did not chase it. She continued to give freely, sometimes to the concern of those who loved her. Money passed through her hands almost as quickly as it arrived. She laughed easily, listened deeply, remembered names when others forgot her own. She carried her age not as decline, but as authority. Not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that invites trust. This season of her life offers a quiet but powerful lesson, that influence does not have to become dominance, that growing older does not require growing smaller, and that wisdom, when held humbly, becomes shelter for others. She endured loss. Her husband, Alexander, died before her. Grief arrived not as a surprise, but as a familiar companion. She had sung about sorrow long enough to recognize its voice. And yet, even here, she did not retreat. She continued to write, continued to serve, continued to show up. Not because she was immune to pain, but because she refused to let pain have the final word. This is perhaps one of the most relatable truths for women, that life does not stop asking things of us when we are tired, that faith must sometimes be practiced with trembling hands. Fanny did not pretend strength she did not feel. She simply leaned into what had carried her before. Her joy in these years was not exuberant, it was settled, the kind that comes from having faced disappointment without surrendering hope. She had become a living witness to the truth she had sung for decades, that assurance is not emotional certainty, but relational trust. People came to her not just for autographs, but for counsel. She listened as she always had. She reminded them, with wit, with kindness, with unwavering faith, that life is not measured by what we see, but by whom we trust. As her body aged, her spirit seemed to widen. She had learned the art of staying soft in a world that rewards hardness, and that softness became her strength. Her presence alone encouraged, her laughter disarmed, her memory astonished, and all the while she remained uninterested in legacy. She did not speak of how she would be remembered, she spoke of how she could still be useful. This is a rare posture, and one worth learning from, because many women fear aging as a narrowing of possibility. Fanny's life tells a different story, that later years can be expansive, that purpose can deepen, that love can become less urgent and more enduring. She was not fading, she was finishing faithfully, and in her gentle, generous, unassuming way, she showed a watching world that the measure of a life well lived is not how loudly it is celebrated, but how steadily it gives. There comes a season in every life when forward motion slows, not because purpose has ended, but because the work has been done. For Fanny Crosby, old age did not arrive as decline, it arrived as completion. Her world grew quieter, the traveling less frequent, the writing slower, the body more fragile, but the spirit remained unmistakably steady. She had lived long enough to watch generations rise and fall, to hear her songs sung by children whose grandparents had sung them before. Time had stretched her life wide, and still she did not cling to it. This is a rare grace, especially for women, who are often taught to measure their worth by how much they are still needed. Fanny did not fear becoming unnecessary. She trusted that what had been given through her would continue without her. As her strength waned, she did not retreat into bitterness or regret. She reflected, not on what she had achieved, but on what had been entrusted. Her blindness had never been healed. Her prayers had not always been answered in the ways she might have imagined, and yet there was no resentment, only gratitude. She spoke often of heaven, not as escape, but as home. She believed that the first face she would ever see would be the face of Christ, and that belief did not frighten her. It steadied her. This, too, offers a lesson rarely taught, that faith, when practiced daily, prepares us not just for living, but for letting go. In her final years, people continued to seek her out, not because she was producing new work, but because she had become one, a living testimony to perseverance without hardness, to generosity without depletion, to confidence without pride. She listened to others speak of their fears, of aging, of regret, of being forgotten, and she answered them with quiet humor and unshakable peace. She did not minimize their concerns. She simply reminded them that nothing offered in love is ever lost. When Fanny Crosby died at 94 years old, the nation paused. Newspapers marked her passing. Churches sang her hymns. Communities mourned, not a celebrity, but a companion. Her funeral was simple, her grave unadorned. There was no need for grandeur. Her legacy had already found its voice. By the time of her death, more than 8,000 hymns bore her name. Over 100 million copies of her songs had been printed, but numbers tell only part of the story. The truest measure of her life cannot be counted. It is heard in hospital corridors at midnight, in prison cells where hope feels dangerous, in sanctuaries where faith is whispered rather than proclaimed. It is felt by women who wonder if it is too late to begin again, by those who fear their quiet faith will never matter. Fanny Crosby's final lesson is not about achievement. It is about trust, that a life surrendered fully, faithfully, does not end in silence. It echoes. Long after the body rests, the song continues, and somewhere, someone sings words they did not write and finds the courage to believe them. Long after a woman's footsteps fade, the world often asks a single question: did she matter? For Fanny Crosby, the answer did not arrive in monuments or memorials. It arrived in melody, in voices she would never hear, in rooms she would never enter, in lives she would never moot. Her story did not conclude at the edge of her lifetime. It expanded. This is the mystery of true legacy. It is not something we leave behind. It is something that continues to move long after we are gone. The early 20th century changed rapidly. Cities rose, technology accelerated, music modernized, and still her hymns endured. They were not preserved out of nostalgia. They survived because they were useful. They spoke to sorrow. They steadied fear. They named hope when language failed. This offers a quiet but powerful lesson, especially for women. You do not have to chase relevance to remain relevant. What is rooted in truth does not expire. Fanny Crosby's hymns crossed denominational lines. They moved from revival tents to cathedral choirs, from small-town churches to global missions. They were sung by people who knew nothing of her blindness, her poverty, or her sacrifices. They only knew the comfort, and that is often the fate of women's work, its fruit enjoyed without its labor being remembered. Yet Fanny would not have resented this. She had never written for recognition. She wrote for need. As the decades passed, her hymns found their way into wars and waiting rooms. They were sung by soldiers far from home, by mothers burying children, by women standing at crossroads, unsure which way to turn. Her words did not promise easy answers. They promised presence. They did not deny suffering. They named a God who walks through it. This is why her legacy outlived her era, because she never pretended life was simple, and she never pretended faith was fragile. Women, especially, found themselves in her songs, not as ideals, not as saints untouched by struggle, but as souls, wounded, faithful, persistent. Her hymns gave language to emotions women were often taught to suppress: longing, exhaustion, courage, surrender. She offered permission to feel deeply and still believe deeply. As generations shifted, new musical styles emerged, yet Fanny's hymns adapted. They were rearranged, reharmonized, translated. The core remained untouched. This, too, is instructive. When the heart of your work is honest, it can wear many forms without losing its soul. Fanny Crosby became part of the spiritual bloodstream of a nation. She shaped how people prayed, how they grieved, how they hoped. And she did it without ever standing at a pulpit, without ever leading an institution, without ever demanding a platform. Her influence was not loud, it was faithful. For women who feel unseen in their labor, raising children, serving quietly, writing words no one applauds, her life offers reassurance. Legacy is not built by visibility, it is built by consistency, by showing up again and again with whatever strength remains, by offering what you have even when it feels small. Fanny Crosby's songs did not change the world overnight. They changed it slowly, one voice at a time, one trembling heart at a time. And that kind of change, the kind that heals rather than impresses, is the kind that lasts. As the world moved forward, Fanny Crosby's voice did not remain behind. It traveled, not carried by her own breath, but by the courage of others who dared to keep singing. The 20th century ushered in a new age of sound. Records replaced hymnals, radios replaced revival tents, choirs gave way to soloists and bands. Music became louder, faster, more crowded, and yet her hymns found room. They slipped into phonographs and broadcasts, into moments of national grief and private longing. They were not forced into relevance. They were welcomed. This is a rare fate for any work, and an even rarer fate for the work of a woman from another century. But Fanny Crosby's songs did not belong to a moment. They belonged to need. Her hymns were recorded by voices she could never have imagined: operatic sopranos, country singers, gospel quartets, modern worship leaders. Different styles, different cultures, different tempos, the same truth. This teaches a quiet lesson to women who fear their work will be forgotten as trends shift and tastes change. What is rooted in sincerity will always find a voice. Her hymns were sung in times of war, when fear became communal. They were sung during economic collapse, when hope felt irresponsible. They were sung at civil rights gatherings, where courage was required just to stand. The words did not change, the world did. And still the words held, because Fanny Crosby never wrote from convenience, she wrote from conviction. She did not ask, "Will this be popular?" She asked, "Will this be faithful?" In the modern era, women are often pressured to brand themselves, to package their voice, to monetize their pain, to perform resilience. Fanny offers a counter-narrative. She reminds us that purpose does not need promotion to endure. Her songs entered new spaces not because they were marketed well, but because they were needed deeply. They became part of films and broadcasts. They echoed through stadiums and sanctuaries. They crossed oceans into languages she never spoke. In moments of disaster, fires, floods, wars, people reached for her words because they already knew them by heart. That is the kind of influence no algorithm can manufacture. It is earned slowly through honesty and persistence. Women, especially, can learn from this endurance. You may feel pressured to reinvent yourself to stay relevant, but reinvention is not the same as faithfulness. Fanny Crosby's work evolved in form, but never in foundation. She allowed her songs to travel, but she did not chase them. She trusted them. There is a deep freedom in that posture, to create without clinging, to offer without controlling, to release without fear. In a world that constantly asks women to prove their worth again and again, her life answers quietly. What is given in love does not need to be defended. As new generations encountered her hymns, many did not know her name. They did not know her story. They only knew the comfort. And perhaps this is the truest mark of legacy, to become so woven into the fabric of hope that your name becomes secondary. Fanny Crosby's voice did not disappear. It multiplied. It learned to travel where she never could, into places she never saw. And there it continued its work, not demanding attention, not seeking applause, simply doing what it had always done, lifting weary hearts toward light. There's a moment, quiet, often overlooked, when a song stops being something we hear and becomes something we live. It is the moment a mother hums in the dark while the world sleeps. The moment a woman sits alone on the edge of her bed, trying to breathe through grief she cannot explain. The moment someone, somewhere, realizes they are still standing after a season they were sure would break them. And in that moment, the words rise again. Perfect submission. All is at rest. Not shouted, not announced, simply remembered. Fanny Crosby never stood in a spotlight. She never commanded a stage. She never saw a crowd lean in or a sea of hands lifted high. And yet, she stands among us still, not as a figure in history, but as a presence in our most vulnerable hours. Her life forces us to confront a question we often avoid. What if limitation is not the end of calling, but the beginning of it? Fanny was blind in a world that equated sight with worth. She was a woman in an age that limited women's voices. She lived through poverty, loss, obscurity, and a culture that rarely celebrated quiet faithfulness. And yet, she chose joy, not the kind that ignores pain, but the kind that walks through it without surrendering hope. For women today, this matters deeply, because many of you carry invisible blindness, dreams delayed, talents overlooked, sacrifices unnoticed, prayers that seem to echo unanswered. You show up, you give, you endure, and the world may never fully applaud you, but Fanny Crosby's life whispers a sacred truth. Your obedience does not require an audience. Your faithfulness is not wasted. Your unseen work still sings. She teaches us that purpose is not always loud, calling is not always dramatic, impact is not always immediate. Sometimes impact looks like consistency, like showing up again, like choosing hope when despair would be easier. Fanny did not ask God to restore her sight. She asked him to use her life. And in doing so, she reminds women everywhere that surrender is not weakness, it is power redirected. As the years passed, her body weakened, but her spirit did not. She aged without bitterness. She gave without resentment. She trusted without demanding explanation. That kind of peace is not accidental. It is cultivated. It is chosen again and again. Her story invites us to examine what we are holding too tightly, our need to be seen, our fear of being forgotten, our anxiety about timing and recognition. Fanny released all of it, and in releasing it, she found rest. Her assurance was not built on circumstances, it was built on trust. And that is a lesson every woman needs in a world that constantly demands performance. You do not have to rush your becoming. You do not have to compete for validation. You do not have to prove your worth to earn God's attention. Your life, just as it is already heard. The same God who shaped a blind girl's words into a global anthem is still shaping lives today, still turning private faith into public blessing, still transforming quiet obedience into lasting legacy. So, if you find yourself in a season of darkness, listen, not for applause, not for affirmation, but for the stillness that says, you are not forgotten. Because assurance does not come from seeing the whole path. It comes from trusting the one who walks it with you. And if this story has stirred something in you, if it has reminded you that your voice matters, your faith matters, your endurance matters, then let it continue. Share this story with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment about what part of Fanny Crosby's journey spoke to your heart. And if you want more stories like this, stories of women whose quiet faith changed the world, subscribe and walk this journey with us. Because somewhere, right now, someone is singing in the dark. And perhaps, because of you, they won't sing alone.